The Arboreal Rip was a form of execution used in ancient Persia in the 6th century BC and later Rome under Emperor Aurelian. The victim's limbs were tied to two bent-back trees held under extreme tension, with their limbs attached to opposite sides. Once the ropes were cut, the trees snapped upright, ripping the body apart instantly. Rebel leader Procopius was executed this way. Liquid fire was a method of execution in ancient Israel and Rome for crimes like treason, prostitution, incest, or adultery. In ancient Israel, molten lead was poured down the throat of the condemned, burning the internal organs. In Rome, it was poured on the head of traitors, causing a rapid, agonizing death. The waist chop was an execution method for treason in ancient China, where victims were cut in half at the waist with a large blade, avoiding vital organs, so death came slowly. It remained in use until its abolition in the 18th century. Scaphism was an ancient Persian execution method considered the absolute worst by many. The victim was trapped lying on his back between two small boats, with head, arms and legs exposed. Then they were force-fed a mixture of milk and honey until severe diarrhea set in, then smeared head to toe with the same mixture. The boats were then pushed into stagnant water, leaving the victim exposed to the sun. Flies, wasps, beetles, and other insects along with rodents were drawn to the sweetness, stinging and eating the flesh of the victim. Rats reportedly entered through the rectum, and the bloated belly from the milk and honey would leak a foul mix of waste and fluids, attracting parasites. The process was repeated daily to prolong suffering. Victims could survive for over 2 weeks, their flesh rotting, swarming with worms and parasites, and their faces so covered in stings that they became unrecognizable. The Iron Maiden was a tall human-shaped metal coffin with doors lined with spikes. When shut, the spikes would pierce the body in non-vital areas, causing deep wounds that bled slowly, keeping the victim alive in agony before eventual death from blood loss, shock or infection. Despite its infamous reputation, there is no evidence it existed in the Middle Ages or at all. However, similar devices were described as being used by the Spartan tyrant Nabis around 200 BC for extortion and murder. The Roman candle was a form of execution in which the victim was coated in a slow-burning flammable substance, tied or nailed to a stake and hoisted into the air. Fire was lit at the base and the flames slowly climbed upward, burning the body over time until death. Emperor Nero reportedly used this method to illuminate his garden parties, often using condemned Christians as the candles. The rat's cup was a method of torture used in medieval Europe in which the victim was strapped down to a flat surface and a small cage or pottery bowl was placed on their stomach or over their face. The cage was then filled with rats, and hot charcoal was placed on top, creating an unbearable heat that forced the rats to burrow into the victim's flesh to escape. Trapped and unable to flee, the rats bit through muscle and tissue while the victim endured unimaginable pain and terror. The Tapeworm Diet was popular in the Victorian era, almost as some kind of self-punishment. It involved swallowing a pill containing a tapeworm egg that would hatch and feed on the host's calories to achieve extreme thinness. The parasite could grow up to 30 feet long and sometimes attach to the heart, eyes, or brain, causing severe illness or death. Excreting this big tapeworm was not only horrifying, but also potentially deadly. If it didn't exit naturally, doctors would insert a metal cylinder with bait through the mouth into the intestines to catch the worm, a procedure that often led to choking fatalities. Damnatio Ad Bestias was a capital punishment in ancient Rome. Condemned individuals were thrown into arenas to be mauled and killed by wild animals like lions, bears, or leopards, often as a public spectacle. The punishment caused excruciating pain from bites and tears, eventually leading to death from blood loss, shock, or organ damage, amplified by the psychological terror of facing ravenous beasts in front of a crowd. The Blood Eagle was a brutal Viking execution in which the victim was laid face down and the ribs were cut away from the spine. The lungs were then pulled through the opening and draped over the shoulders to look like wings. It was described in Scandinavian poetry as an offering to Odin, and used for the most serious crimes, such as avenging a murdered father. Historians debate whether it was actually practiced. The head crusher was used in medieval Europe, especially during the Inquisition. The victim was placed into a device consisting of a metal cap over the head and a plate under the jaw, connected by a screw. Tightening the screw gradually crushed the skull, shattering bones, popping out eyes, and compressing the brain, ultimately causing death. It was used during interrogations and trials to force confessions or punish the accused. Ishikozume was a ritual form of public execution practiced in ancient Japan, in which the condemned was buried up to the waist in earth and then stoned to death. The throwing of stones caused severe injuries and prolonged suffering before death. This method was reserved for the worst offenses, but also for killing a sacred deer or maintaining unregistered rice fields. Hanging and quartering was a brutal punishment in 13th century Britain and Ireland for convicted male traitors. The victim was tied to a wooden panel and dragged behind a horse to the execution site, sometimes taking hours over rough, jagged terrain. There they were hanged nearly to death, then emasculated, disemboweled, beheaded, and cut into 4 parts, in case they were still alive. The remains were displayed publicly, like on London Bridge, to warn others against committing high treason. Gunga Rao was a capital punishment used in Asia, especially ancient India, around 200 BC, involving trained elephants to kill the victim slowly, crushing limb by limb before finishing them by stomping on the head. In some cases, victims were tied to stakes and thrown into the air by the elephant's trunk to soften them up before they were crushed. An even more elaborate way involved training the elephant to slice the victim to pieces with sharp metal tied to their feet and tusks. The process was deliberately prolonged to maximize pain and was often performed publicly for cheering spectators. Backbreaking was used during the 13th century Mongol Empire, often as execution of nobles to avoid bloodshed. The condemned would be tightly wrapped in a heavy carpet, and then their spine would be forcibly broken either by bending or by trampling, often by horses. The victim endured severe agony from crushed bones and damaged organs until dying from internal trauma. Impalement was an execution method used by ancient Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians for treason. First, a slit was made in the booty of the victim. A long tapered stake was then driven into the body with a mallet, emerging at the chest, shoulders, or head. Executioners carefully avoided vital organs to prolong the agony. The victim was lifted and planted on the stake, often with supports to prevent the stake from piercing fully, leaving them suspended and suffering for hours or even days. During this time, the person endured extreme pain from gravity pulling down on their body, internal injury, and exposure. Vlad the Impaler, 15th century ruler of Wallachia, reportedly impaled over 20,000 Turks in a single day while watching the process during his meals. A Turkish variation was gaunching. It involved hoisting victims by rope and dropping them onto sharp hooks, leading to death over days from wounds and trauma. The stone press method involved the victim being laid on their back while increasingly heavy stones were placed on their chest. The relentless weight compressed the lungs and internal organs, making each breath more difficult and causing intense pain. If the accused refused to plead, the pressure would eventually lead to suffocation or fatal internal trauma. One of the most infamous cases occurred during the Salem witch trials in 1692, when Giles Corey was slowly crushed to death. Keelhauling was a brutal punishment often used by pirates or navies for serious offenses such as a mutiny. A condemned sailor was tied to a rope that ran beneath the ship and thrown overboard on one side. They were then dragged under the ship's hull, scraping against barnacles, rough wood and metal fittings, tearing into the skin, leaving deep lacerations and exposing raw flesh. The sting of salt water on open wounds intensified the pain, while the violent movement could cause broken bones or head injuries. Drowning was also common. If they survived round 1, there was often a round 2. The mare's tail was a punishment used in medieval and early modern Europe, especially in France, for heinous crimes. The condemned was tied by their arms and legs to 4 horses, which were then driven in opposite directions. The violent pulling dislocated joints and tore ligaments, eventually ripping the body apart. The breaking wheel was a gruesome method used in Europe until the 19th century, reserved for the worst offenders. The condemned was taken to a raised scaffold and tied down with their body slightly elevated by wooden blocks under their joints. A heavy wooden wheel was then repeatedly dropped on their limbs, typically starting with the feet and working upward, carefully breaking bones without causing immediate death. The aim was to inflict maximum pain. After the limbs were shattered, the victim was tied into the spokes of the wheel and hoisted onto a mast, left to die slowly. The Bull of Phalaris was a device from ancient Greece, designed as a hollow bronze bull with a door on one side. The condemned were locked inside with their head positioned in the bull's head, and a fire was lit beneath the metal body. As the bronze heated, the victim slowly roasted alive, their screams amplified by an internal acoustic system to sound like the bellowing of a bull. Steam from the cooking flesh escaped through the bull's nostrils. The Roman sack, or Poena cullei, was a horrific punishment reserved for those convicted of parricide in ancient Rome. The condemned would be sewn into a leather sack, along with a dog, snake, monkey, and rooster, before being thrown into the sea. Death came not only from drowning, but also from the terror of being confined with aggressive animals. Hanging by the ribs was a method that involved an iron hook driven beneath the victim's ribs, lifting them off the ground and suspending them. This caused excruciating pain as the weight of the body pulled against the internal organs and flesh, tearing tissue. Known as the Cengela in the 18th century Ottoman-controlled Bosnia, it was also used in the 1770s Dutch Suriname to punish rebellious slaves. Boiling alive was one of the most brutal and inhumane forms of execution in history. Practiced in many parts of Europe and Japan, it was reserved for severe crimes. The condemned would be placed into a large cauldron or sealed kettle filled with water, oil, tar, or tallow, which was then heated to extreme temperatures. Death was slow as the heat first seared the skin and fat, causing immediate incredible pain before gradually cooking the internal organs. Sawing was a method mainly practiced in ancient Rome, Persia, and in parts of Africa and Asia. The condemned was hung upside down, which caused blood to rush to the head, prolonging consciousness and awareness. The executioner then used a saw to cut the victim vertically, starting from the groin and moving upward, tearing through flesh, muscle, and nerves. In some cases, executioners paused when the saw reached the victim's belly button, leaving them suspended to suffer further. Flaying, or being skinned alive, was one of the most agonizing methods practiced by the Assyrians, Chinese, Aztecs, and in medieval Europe. The process began by softening the skin by either exposing the victim to scorching sunlight to cause severe burns, or immersing them in boiling water, making the skin swell and easier to cut. The executioner would then make deep cuts around a section of skin and slowly peel it away by hand, tearing nerve endings from the underlying muscle and sending overwhelming pain signals to the brain. This was done over hours or even days. Victims remained alive during much of the process, eventually dying from blood loss, shock, infection, or even hypothermia. The Assyrians were notorious for flaying rebels and using their skin to cover city walls. Lingchi, known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a Chinese execution method designed to prolong suffering by slicing the victim's body again and again without causing fatal blood loss. It was used for crimes like treason, murder, or spreading rumors. Executioners made deliberate cuts that exposed flesh and eventually bone, while keeping the victim alive for hours or even days. Some emperors demanded every part of the body eventually be removed. A rare variation involved burying the victim up to the neck, cutting open the scalp in a cross shape, peeling back the skin, and pouring mercury into the wound. The poison separated skin from flesh, and as the victims struggled to free themselves, their skin tore away from their body. Crucifixion was a capital punishment used by the Persians, Carthaginians, and the Romans. The victim was stripped naked, scourged, and beaten, then forced to carry a heavy wooden cross to the execution site. Then they were nailed to the cross through the hands and feet, often enduring additional beatings and humiliation. Left suspended and bleeding, the victims suffered from dehydration, starvation, infection, and the slow collapse of their body under its own weight. Many died from asphyxiation once they became too weak to push up and breathe. Others succumbed to sepsis or exposure. Death could take days, sometimes over a week. Immurement was a punishment in the Roman Empire and Persia, where a person was walled into a tight, enclosed space without exits. When used as a death sentence, the condemned was left to die slowly from starvation or suffocation in total darkness and isolation. The space was often so narrow that the victim could barely move, compounding the agony with extreme claustrophobia. Scalping was the practice of cutting or tearing away part of the human scalp, with the hair still attached, while the victim was alive. It was often carried out in the context of warfare, with the scalp taken as a trophy. The practice was recorded across Europe, China, and the Americas. The act itself was agonizing, as the scalp is dense with nerves and blood vessels, and the tearing away of skin caused immense pain. While some survived, most died due to blood loss, shock, or infections.